Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? Because time matters here. At certain hours, those when the world grows quiet and the shadows stretch just a little longer, some stories press harder against the edges of what we believe is real. Tonight, we examine something old, not a monster, not a god, but something more human, something that watches from behind human eyes. There is a figure that haunts cosmic horror, not by size or power, but through those who whisper its name in hidden places. We do not know where these followers come from. We do not know what they want, but they always seem to know us. Every myth needs believers. And the most unsettling truth is this: the believers in these stories are not chasing madness. They're protecting it. The oldest cults in cosmic horror do not shout or proselytize. They wait, in ruins, in families, in towns whose names vanish from maps. They exist not to spread fear, but to survive it, and in doing so, pass it on. So we ask, which is worse, the thing being worshipped, or the ones who understand why it must be? Let's begin. And if something in this disturbs you, remember, it has waited longer than you've been alive. The early 20th century bore witness to a deep fracture in humanity's self-perception. Scientific revolutions, Darwinian evolution, Einstein's relativity, Freud's psychoanalysis, had steadily eroded the central place of humankind in the cosmos. But it was World War I that shattered any illusion of rational progress. In this environment of disillusionment and spiritual vacancy, cosmic horror emerged not as escapism, but as confrontation. Cults within this genre do not offer rebellion. They embody surrender. They arise in fiction where society fails, where reason collapses, and where truth, if it exists at all, comes at an unbearable cost. Lovecraft did not create cults to be theatrical villains. He crafted them as disturbing inversions of organized religion and Enlightenment values. In his private letters, he often described civilization as fragile, a thin crust over a deep chaos. Cults, in this worldview, are not enemies of society, but its shadow. They preserve knowledge deemed obscene precisely because it reveals that the cosmos is impersonal. Unlike typical antagonists, Lovecraft's cultists are not madmen. They are correct in ways that destabilize everything else. Consider this carefully. To Lovecraft, belief in cosmic entities was not irrational. It was horrifying because it made sense if one accepted the insignificance of human life. At the same time, Lovecraft was writing, secretive spiritual movements gained popularity in America and Europe. The Theosophical Society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and fringe Masonic offshoots claimed access to hidden truths through ritual. These organizations were often Eurocentric, syncretic, and obsessed with lost civilizations, tropes that Lovecraft absorbed and distorted. He stripped away their utopian aims and recast their rites as invitations to something inhuman. Unlike Theosophy, which promised enlightenment through ascended masters, Lovecraft's cults promised only survival or transformation under alien eyes. This was not mysticism in search of transcendence. It was fatalism, thinly masked as worship. Lovecraft's cults were deeply entangled with colonial fears. His writings repeatedly depict remote jungles, swamps, and coastal settlements as places where degenerate groups preserve ancient blasphemies. These portrayals, while marred by Lovecraft's racism, reflect a broader cultural anxiety in the West, that the rational order of modern life could be overwhelmed by something older, stranger, and immune to reason. In the Call of Cthulhu, for example, The cult spans continents, linking Pacific Islanders, voodoo practitioners, and swamp dwellers into a unified network of cosmic devotion. The implication is chilling. Civilization may dominate the surface, but beneath it lie older truths, kept alive by those excluded from power. The cult in cosmic horror does not symbolize resistance. It inverts what we expect from religious groups. These are not communities seeking salvation, but ones embracing revelation without rescue. They worship beings that are neither good nor evil, but wholly indifferent. This is the horror. Not that these entities hate us, but that they don't need to. Cults emerge as repositories of truths that destroy the framework of meaning. Unlike traditional religions, which impose structure, these cults dissolve it. Ritual, for them, is not communication. It is exposure. Each act is a declaration that the world does not work the way we think it does. Lovecraft never wrote from within a cult's perspective. His narrators are always outsiders, academics, skeptics, or curious investigators. This creates deliberate containment. The cult remains unknowable, glimpsed only through fragments, a chant overheard, a statue recovered, a dream shared by too many. This distance maintains the horror. If we ever fully understood the cult, its terror would vanish. By positioning the cult on the margins of comprehension, Lovecraft preserves its narrative power. It becomes an epistemological threat, a presence we cannot explain but must account for. Their very partiality in the text keeps them alive. That leads us to their symbols, names, and speech. If cults in cosmic horror thrive in the margins of society, they also exist in the margins of language. Their chants resist translation. Their gods have names that rupture phonetics. In the next section, we will explore how language itself becomes a barrier, or perhaps a filter, through which the cult exerts its presence. We will see how invented tongues and symbolic codes serve not only to obscure, but to wound. If the cult survives, it is not because it hides. It is because language cannot contain what it truly means to say. In many traditions, belief systems evolve to soothe. They offer moral order, divine purpose, or paths to salvation. But the cults found in cosmic horror literature grow from older soil. They trace their conceptual roots not to comfort, but to dread. Specifically, dread of a universe where meaning fails. Their philosophical ancestry winds through pessimism, Gnosticism, and the anthropological gaze. Understanding this lineage clarifies why these cults feel so wrong. They are not crude fictional devices. They are the natural outgrowth of systems designed to erode human centrality. Cosmic horror cults echo ancient mystery religions, but with critical differences. In Eleusinian or Dionysian rites, the initiate sought rebirth or divine ecstasy. In contrast, Lovecraftian cults initiate through revelation, not renewal. Knowledge is granted, but it offers no transformation beyond despair. Consider the Starry Wisdom sect. Its scriptures promise visions from Nyarlathotep. But no, enlightenment follows, only dissolution. The philosophical inversion is subtle, but absolute. The initiate is not elevated, but stripped of illusion. What remains is the truth of one's own irrelevance. Western pessimism also casts a long shadow here. Thinkers like Schopenhauer and later Thomas Ligotti emphasize suffering as the basic condition of existence. For Ligotti, horror is not a genre, but a mode of philosophy. Cosmic horror cults can be read as embodiments of this logic. They do not deny suffering or resist it. They worship its source. The gods they serve are not sadistic, merely indifferent. And so the cultist, in embracing that indifference, rejects the last psychological refuge, that pain must mean something. The influence of Gnostic cosmology is more oblique but significant. In many Gnostic texts, the material world is a prison, created by a flawed or false god. Salvation comes through gnosis, esoteric knowledge that reveals the deeper, hidden structure of reality. Cosmic horror reverses the polarity. Here, gnosis is not redemptive but corrosive. The deeper one sees, the more horrifying the pattern becomes. The cult, then, plays a dual role, both prison keeper and truth bearer. It does not liberate, but it shows, and once seen, the knowledge cannot be forgotten. There is also an anthropological dimension to the cult's construction, one rooted in early 20th century ethnography. Lovecraft and his contemporaries were deeply influenced by the language of anthropology, though often filtered through colonial prejudice. Exotic rites, savage traditions, and degenerate customs became recurring motifs. But beneath the bigotry lies something more enduring, the fear that rationality is thin. The cult becomes a symbolic other, not just culturally, but cognitively. Its rituals mock coherence. Its myths resist decoding. This makes the cult a site of epistemic instability. The implications are profound. Unlike villains in conventional horror, these cults do not want revenge, power, or even recognition. They function more like spiritual sinkholes. They exist to preserve a truth that the larger world denies, and to embody its consequences. They are not trying to win. They are trying to endure. And their endurance implies something unspoken, that the reality they serve is stronger than the one we inhabit, that it will outlast us, that it already has. From these roots, mystery religion, Gnostic heresy, philosophical pessimism, and colonial anthropology emerges a unique literary device. The cult in cosmic horror is not merely scary. It is structurally wrong. It operates by different laws, speaks in broken tongues, and worships ideas we can barely frame, let alone oppose. It is the cracked mirror through which we glimpse another kind of world. A world where the only meaning is that there is none. But even meaninglessness needs language to survive. In the next section, we'll turn to the way these cults speak, or refuse to desuis, speak. We'll examine how invented words, fractured syntax, and symbolic distortion become tools not for communication, but for containment. When horror moves into language, the reader is no longer safe. The ritual begins. The cults of cosmic horror rarely speak in plain terms. Their language is not made to persuade or explain. It is designed to exclude, distort, and obscure. From the earliest appearances of Religian phrases to the layered symbology of blasphemous tomes, these cults weaponize language itself. Their speech patterns, names, and symbols do not merely create atmosphere. They enact a deeper narrative function. They signal that we have entered a semantic terrain where understanding becomes treacherous. This is not just about strangeness, it is about fracture. Words, when used by the cult, break the rules we thought were fixed. The names of the cults themselves resist simplicity. The esoteric order of Dagon evokes a hybrid of fish god theology and secret fraternity. Esoteric promises hidden knowledge while implying its inaccessibility. The Church of Starry Wisdom suggests astronomical devotion, but the juxtaposition of church with a deliberately vague cosmic reference produces unease. This isn't a case of naming for identity. It's naming as obfuscation. The more precise the name appears, the more it implies something larger and unstated. These titles operate like half-buried inscriptions, readable in form, but hostile in function. Invented languages in cosmic horror serve an even more disquieting role. The infamous Finglui Mgwunaf, Cthulhu R'lie Wgah Nagel Ftagen, is not just gibberish. It follows a phonetic pattern that mimics liturgical chant. Its structure resembles real-world magical incantations, grounding the absurdity in familiar cadence. This illusion of structure is key. Readers often report an instinctive sense that the line means something, that its rhythm holds coherence just out of reach, that emotional effect is intentional. The language seems to reach us without our consent. It bypasses comprehension and still unsettles. This strategy aligns with ancient magical theory, where the power of a word lies not in its meaning, but in its sound. Enochian, the so-called angelic language of John Dee and Edward Kelly, was similarly constructed to evoke authority and mystery, even as its semantic rules remained opaque. Lovecraft admired such constructs, not for their content, but for their effect. His cults speak in ways that reintroduce a pre-modern belief that to say a thing is to call it into being. Thus, their language is not just strange, it is dangerous. Equally important are the symbols these cults use: sigils, glyphs, geometric impossibilities. These are not decorations. They act as narrative traps. In the Dunwich Horror, the runes etched into a barn's floor don't just suggest a ritual, they perform one, even in the passive gaze of the reader. In the Call of Cthulhu, a bas-relief's design is so unnatural, it induces cognitive discomfort. The visual becomes linguistic, a kind of communication that bypasses language and directly strikes the viewer's sense of reality. The cults know this. Their use of symbols is not ornamental, it is tactical. It's important to see how this linguistic strategy also reinforces thematic intent. The cult's language signals a philosophical divide. If the gods they worship exist beyond time, form, and morality, then human language must be insufficient. To worship such entities requires breaking language, unmaking it. What emerges is not a new tongue, but the remains of communication. This is what Reliahian, the Necronomicon's passages and carved symbols represent: language as residue. Not X, but the thing X fails to describe. By corrupting names, shattering syntax, and distorting signs, cosmic horror cults imply something terrifying: that truth may not be communicable, or worse, that it shouldn't be. The few who attempt translation, scholars, investigators, victims, are routinely punished. Their minds degrade, their speech collapses. They begin to echo what they once feared. This isn't a warning about forbidden knowledge. It's a demonstration of what it does to the structures we rely on to define the world. But if language fails, what then sustains the myth? The answer lies in authenticity, not empirical, but narrative. In the next section, we turn to the tools used to convince readers that these cults have always existed. We will explore how fictional documents, invented scholars, and intertextual echoes build a world so complete that disbelief becomes unnecessary. The cult doesn't ask you to believe. It only asks that you read. Authenticity in cosmic horror is never direct. The cults that haunt these stories do not announce themselves with certainty. They accumulate. They emerge through scattered accounts, mismatched records, unreliable narrators, and contradictory timelines. This strategy, often described as myth building, serves a precise function: to erode the boundary between fiction and history. The more a cult feels embedded in hidden continuity, layered beneath known civilizations, supported by obscure documents, the more persuasive its horror becomes. The goal is not to convince, but to remove the need for disbelief. Lovecraft's genius lay in his use of invented scholarship. The Necronomicon is the clearest example, presented as a blasphemous tome written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. But its power lies in context, not content. It appears not in grand scenes, but as an aside, quoted in fragments, catalogued in university libraries, debated by fictional academics. The effect is cumulative. By dispersing mentions of the book across unrelated stories, Lovecraft created the illusion of a shared history. Readers encountering the cult in the Dunwich Horror already know the Necronomicon from the Call of Cthulhu. But only partially, that partiality strengthens the myth. Supporting this illusion are narrative techniques drawn from realism. Newspaper clippings, police reports, ship logs, personal diaries. These epistolary fragments appear throughout the mythos. They act as evidence, but they rarely align. Instead, they contradict or distort each other, suggesting multiple lenses on a single, invisible event. The cult itself remains just out of reach, visible only through what others say about it. This mimics how historical knowledge is assembled, never whole, always interpretive. Fictional cults gain power by behaving like real mysteries, glimpsed, debated, never resolved. The strategy extends beyond Lovecraft. His contemporaries and successors, August Derleth, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, contributed additional cults, deities, and documents. These intertextual references weren't coordinated, but they shared a tone, serious, clinical, detached. By mimicking academic prose, the stories established a kind of internal legitimacy. Over time, the cults began to feel like they belonged not to one author, but to an occult canon. Their mythos grew not through clarity, but through consistency. Not X, but the illusion of X across time and space. This method has implications. It turns the reader into an archaeologist, piecing together scattered clues from unreliable witnesses. This makes the cult feel personal, not because it addresses the reader directly, but because the reader must reconstruct it. That act of reconstruction mirrors initiation. The reader is no longer simply observing horror. They are enacting the process by which cults are formed, gathering fragments, assembling meaning, drawing connections where none are confirmed. The act of reading becomes the ritual. Perhaps most unsettling is the implication that the cult has always been there. The stories suggest that worship of these entities predates recorded history, carved into stone, hidden in ruins, encoded in dream. This imagined antiquity lends weight to their endurance. If the cult was here before language, before law, before gods, what could possibly remove it? Its survival becomes proof of its truth, even if that truth is unspeakable. And yet, no matter how convincing the structure, the ultimate meaning remains elusive. This is by design. The cult is not meant to be fully known. It is meant to feel known, in the way a dream feels real until you wake. Its authenticity lies not in factual detail, but in emotional resonance. Readers don't believe in the cult because it makes sense. They believe because it doesn't. And that dissonance mirrors the world the cult claims to represent. In the next part of our exploration, we move from structure to substance. Having seen how cults are constructed for believability, we now examine what they mean. What philosophical forces do they serve? What themes do they embody? And why do they so often lead to madness rather than insight? The shape of the cult is only the beginning. Its purpose lies deeper still. Cosmic horror is not powered by violence or gore. Its true engine is displacement. It dislocates the human mind from any meaningful position in the universe. The cults that appear in this literature, fragmented, blasphemous, and maddening, are not frightening because of what they do, but because of what they understand. They stand as symbols of three interlocking ideas: the radical insignificance of the human, the inevitability of cosmic decay, and the instability of reality itself. These are not themes layered onto the genre. They are its foundations. Insignificance in cosmic horror is not a metaphor. It is a cosmological fact. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator states, "We live on a placid island of ignorance, and it was not meant that we should voyage far." This warning is not about knowledge per se, but about position. Cults exist precisely because they have abandoned the illusion that humanity is central. They are not nihilists. They are realists operating under new physics. Their rituals do not flatter the human ego. They mock it. To worship something vast and alien is, in these stories, to accept that we are no more consequential than spores in a petri dish. This leads directly to entropy. Unlike traditional religious structures that seek preservation or salvation, cults in cosmic horror are often aligned with disintegration. The worship of Azathoth, the blind idiot god, is a case in point. Azathoth is not malevolent. It is chaos incarnate, a bubbling, formless center to a universe that only appears ordered. Cultists of Azathoth do not seek control. They surrender to the loss of it. This is the heart of the horror. Not the destruction of the world, but the revelation that the world is already decaying, and the cult has simply chosen to rot first. This entropic tendency is reinforced by their rites. In the Dunwich horror, the Whateleys enact a ritual not to create, but to open, to dissolve. The barrier between worlds. It is not a generative act. It's an erasure. The land becomes sick. Animals miscarry. Weather collapses into storms. The environment itself reflects the logic of entropy. Ritual, in these texts, is not preservation of tradition. It is the systemic breakdown of coherence, physical, moral, linguistic. But it is the nature of reality itself that cosmic horror most radically undermines. Dream and waking, fact and hallucination, life and death, all blur under the influence of these cults. In the shadow out of time, reality becomes permeable. Minds swap bodies across centuries. Memory collapses into fiction. Cults become vectors of this epistemic instability. They teach not doctrine, but doubt. Their sacred texts, if they can be read at all, induce dreamlike visions that resist interpretation, not because they are too complex, but because they are too true, and that truth is structurally incompatible with sanity. The Dreamlands reinforce this principle. Here, in Lovecraft's extended mythos, dream is not a metaphor, but a geography, one accessed by certain rituals and bloodlines. Cults who operate in both realms blur ontological lines. What is dreamed becomes real. What is real is suddenly suspect. The cult, again, is not merely frightening, it is redefining. Its beliefs do not depend on waking logic. They operate on a deeper, older rhythm, a logic of sleep, of cycles, of things that recur without cause. This is where the reader is most at risk. Traditional horror erects a boundary between observer and subject. Cosmic horror erases it. By encountering these cults, the reader must confront the fact that meaning may be subjective, fragile, or fabricated. The cultist is not a lunatic, but a person who has accepted that foundational truths, identity, morality, purpose, are not universal. They are local customs, and local customs are easily abandoned. As we move forward, these concepts will sharpen. If insignificance defines the cult's worldview, and entropy its process, and dream its terrain. Then what remains is the human cost. What happens when ordinary people encounter these forces? In the next section, we turn to madness, not as a breakdown, but as a byproduct of forbidden clarity. The mind does not shatter because it is weak. It shatters because it is paying attention. The cults of cosmic horror do not operate alone. They exist in relation to something greater, beings whose nature resists articulation. These entities are not gods in the classical sense. They do not embody morality, do not crave worship, and do not intervene to save or punish. Instead, they embody concepts: decay, chaos, multiplicity, non-being. To understand the cult, we must first examine what it serves. The relationship between cult and entity in cosmic horror is not transactional. It is gravitational. The cult is drawn into orbit, not by choice, but by exposure. The most iconic of these entities is Cthulhu. Described as a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, Cthulhu is less a character than a cipher. He sleeps beneath the Pacific in the sunken city of R'lyeh, sending dreams that reach across the globe. His cult does not act to awaken him through faith. It merely waits for the stars to align. This passive posture is important. It reveals that the cult is not the cause of the horror, but its witness. In cosmic horror, the event is inevitable. The cult simply survives long enough to remember it when it returns. Contrast this with Nyarlathotep, who is not sleeping, but walking. Known as the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep appears in many guises, often human, always deceitful. Unlike the other entities, he speaks, he performs, he manipulates. His cults are not passive vessels, but active tools, spreading madness with precision. Where Cthulhu represents unconscious dread, Nyarlathotep introduces intentional disruption. His influence blurs the line between worshipper and puppet. Those who follow him do not always know they are doing so. He speaks in riddles, offers visions, and dismantles minds with promises of clarity. His cults do not seek knowledge, they deliver it, at the cost of identity. Yog-Sothoth occupies a different conceptual space. Described as the key and the gate, he is both outside and within all time and space. Worship of Yog-Sothoth often appears in contexts of forbidden science or arcane experimentation. In the Dunwich Horror, the Whateleys summon him to breach dimensions. Their ritual is not devotion, it is access. This cult treats the entity not as a god, but as a cosmic mechanism, yet the results are the same. Madness follows. The implication is clear. To interact with these beings is to engage with structures that exceed human limits. Whether one prays or calculates, the outcome is collapse. Shub-Niggurath, the so-called black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, is often associated with fertility and excess. Her cults are marked by biological horror, uncontrolled reproduction, hybrid offspring, grotesque abundance. In stories that reference her, the horror is not void, but surfeit. Too much life, too quickly, in the wrong forms. Her presence reveals a different side of cosmic horror, not cold indifference, but suffocating fecundity. Her cultists are often transformed, physically and spiritually, into extensions of her will. They become nodes in a larger system, absorbed into something both alive and alien. These entities are never fully visible. Even when described, the accounts are partial, contradictory, and inadequate. This is intentional. Cosmic horror depends on partial knowledge. The entities must remain just beyond the reach of comprehension. Their cults function as interfaces, human attempts to structure the unstructured. Through ritual, language, and symbol, they try to map what cannot be mapped, and in doing so, they fail. But it is in that failure that horror resides. The cult does not protect from the entity, it exposes others to it. We must pause here. The structure of these cults, fragmented, generational, globally distributed, mirrors the incomprehensibility of their gods. Just as the gods cannot be defined, the cults cannot be contained. They exist in ruins, in whispers, in bloodlines. They move through history like shadows cast by something too large to see. To study them is to chart the wake of an unseen force, one that has no interest in humanity, only consequences for those who look too long. But someone must look. In the next section, we turn to the human element. How do people come into contact with these cults? What draws them in, and what does it cost? We will explore madness not as failure, but as transformation. The mind, once opened, does not return unchanged. It witnesses, and witnessing is its own kind of worship. Madness in cosmic horror is not a malfunction. It is a consequence. When ordinary individuals come into contact with cults that worship ancient, incomprehensible beings, the result is rarely resistance. It is transformation. The cult does not forcibly convert, it reveals. And what it reveals is unbearable. Sanity in this genre is not a baseline condition, but a fragile construction. To lose it is not necessarily to fall, but to shift into alignment with a deeper, crueler order. The cult provides the catalyst. The human mind supplies the collapse. Exposure is often gradual. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator begins as a detached observer, investigating rumors of strange behavior in a coastal town. But as he uncovers the town's pact with deep-sea beings, he doesn't recoil. He dreams of underwater cities. He sees changes in his reflection. Eventually, he discovers he is part of the bloodline. Madness does not arrive with violence. It arrives with belonging. The cult reveals what was always true. He doesn't go mad because he learns too much. He goes mad because he remembers. This model recurs. In The Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse raids a swamp cult. He brings back idols, transcripts, terrified prisoners. The ritual has ended, the worshippers scattered. And yet, something lingers. The documents spread. Dreams begin. Artists draw strange shapes. Madness is not localized to the cult, it radiates. Contact, even secondhand, is contamination. The cult does not need to survive physically. Its influence travels through symbols, through stories, through thought. Madness becomes viral. What's critical is that madness in these texts is often indistinguishable from understanding. Those who suffer it are not irrational. They are accurate. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the narrator concludes, "I know too much, and the cult still lives." His breakdown is not the result of delusion, but of contact with truth. Not X, but the unbearable realization that X has always been the case. This reframes madness not as failure of the mind, but as its final, honest act. The cult thrives on this ambiguity. It offers no clear doctrine, no stable belief system. What it provides is exposure to gods who are indifferent, to structures that invalidate morality, to histories that predate humanity. Initiation into the cult is not marked by ritual alone. It is marked by epistemic collapse. Language fails. Categories blur. Time becomes porous. Members often speak in riddles or paradoxes, not because they are deceivers, but because they no longer have access to linear thought. This process does not erase identity outright. It warps it. In the festival, the narrator returns to his ancestral town for a strange winter ceremony. He encounters inhuman revelers, subterranean rituals, and ancient texts. By the end, he has not gone insane in a theatrical sense. He has been absorbed. He lives among humans, but something in him has shifted. His reality has changed, and he can no longer articulate the difference. The cult does not need loyalty. It needs witnesses. We must pause here. Madness in cosmic horror is often seen as a warning, but it may be something more complex. It may be a kind of translation error. The human mind, built for survival in a narrow band of reality, fails when exposed to a larger schema. The cult introduces that schema. And the result is what we call madness, though it might more accurately be called recognition. The scream at the end of the ritual is not fear. It is comprehension. In the next section, we examine what makes this possible. If madness is the effect, what is the cause? The answer lies in forbidden knowledge, the texts, symbols, and revelations that act as gateways. Cults are not the source of horror. They are its librarians. And every ritual, every chant, every secret name is a door you should not open, but some do. And what comes through is not just knowledge. It is something that wants to remain known. Forbidden knowledge is the true sacrament of cosmic horror cults. Unlike traditional religions, which guard sacred truths with reverence, these cults offer access to truths that ruin. Their sacred texts, sigils, and invocations do not illuminate, they unmake. What they reveal is not evil, but structurelessness. Reality, they insist, is not a coherent system, but a thin illusion. The cult is not a path to understanding. It is a terminal encounter with epistemic collapse, the point where knowing something becomes indistinguishable from being destroyed by it. The Necronomicon remains the most infamous vessel of this knowledge. Its pages, supposedly written by the mad poet Abdul al-Hazred, contain rituals, genealogies, and cosmologies that defy logic. But the book's horror lies less in its content than in its effect. Those who study it, Francis Wayland Thurston, Dr. Armitage, countless unnamed scholars, do not gain power. They suffer. They lose time, sanity, self. In the Dunwich horror, the Necronomicon enables the Whateleys to summon Yog-Sothoth, but it offers no control. The book opens a door and then steps aside. That indifference is the point. This is the nature of forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror. It does not mislead. It clarifies. But the clarification is fatal. Language bends. Perception twists. Identity becomes porous. In The Haunter of the Dark, Robert Blake gazes too long into a mysterious gem, the shining trapezohedron, and awakens something ancient. The knowledge does not strike immediately. It waits. When it arrives, it takes the form of revelation paired with annihilation. The horror here is conceptual. What Blake sees is not a monster, but a reality incompatible with human consciousness. The cult does not need to explain it. The artifact does the work. We must pause here. The traditional idea of forbidden knowledge implies a choice. In cosmic horror, that choice is often irrelevant. Contact is contamination. Even peripheral exposure can destabilize the mind. The cult becomes a vector, not of belief, but of exposure. It preserves fragments of ancient speech, conducts incomprehensible rituals, and maintains texts written in geometries that defy Euclidean space. Each element serves the same function, to transmit the untransmittable. What makes the knowledge forbidden is not secrecy, but impact. It is not hidden because it is false. It is hidden because it changes those who know it. This epistemic destabilization often manifests as repetition, madness, or compulsion. Victims begin drawing sigils, muttering in dead tongues, isolating themselves. In The Call of Cthulhu, the the sculptor Wilcox is tormented by dreams he cannot understand. He sculpts forms he has never seen. His art becomes an unconscious transcription of another world. This is not expression, it is infection. The knowledge acts through him. He is no longer subject, but medium. And the cult, whether present or distant, recognizes him as one of their own. Importantly, the cult does not treat this collapse as failure. It treats it as confirmation. Their texts are not intended to enlighten the outsider. They are tools for internal alignment, filters that select the willing from the weak. In this way, forbidden knowledge becomes initiatory. The horror is not just what the initiate learns. It is that they agree. They come to see the cult's truth as not only plausible, but inevitable. Madness is reinterpreted as insight. The reader, like the initiate, is left with a single disturbing thought. What if they're right? As we move next into literary case studies, we'll see how this knowledge functions in narrative, not just as a plot device, but as a method of transmission. Cosmic horror stories mimic the cults they describe. They fragment themselves, scatter their truths across pages and narrators. In doing so, they turn the act of reading into its own subtle ritual. The story itself becomes a site of contact, and what comes through may not be a conclusion, but a crack. One you can't quite unsee. The cult in cosmic horror did not emerge from nowhere. It arrived fully embedded in H.P. Lovecraft's earliest mythos stories as a narrative necessity. His goal was not just to horrify, but to imply that horror had always existed, hidden beneath the surface of known history. From the very beginning, cults served this function. They provided continuity across disconnected stories, suggesting a shared, ancient, and inescapable reality. This structural role explains why cults appear in fragments, never centered, always peripheral. Their power lies in implication. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, the archetype is established with near-clinical precision. The story is presented as a compilation of documents, ship logs, dreams, police reports, all pointing to an underground cult with global reach. Inspector Legrasse's 1908 raid on a Louisiana swamp uncovers a group chanting in an unknown language around a crude idol of Cthulhu. They worshipped, the terrified captives explain, a great old one who lies dead and dreaming. This is not a religion. It is an infection preserved through centuries, surfacing only when conditions permit. Crucially, the cult is shown to predate civilization. It connects modern madness with primeval worship, stitching past and present into a single unbroken horror. This model recurs with variation in the Dunwich Horror, 1929. Here, the Whately family acts as a localized cult devoted to Yog-Sothoth. They are not a crowd, but a lineage, a degraded bloodline executing ancient rites in rural Massachusetts. Their purpose is more deliberate than Cthulhu's followers. They actively seek to open a gate between worlds. Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the narrative tells us, and the key. The Whateleys function as interpreters of this paradox, initiating a child not through education, but through ritual summoning. The story expands the cult concept from disorganized belief to orchestrated cosmic engineering. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, marks another evolution. Rather than a secret sect, the entire town functions as a cult. Through a pact with the Deep Ones, the citizens gain wealth and longevity at the cost of their humanity. The transformation is generational. Some of them have queer things about them, a local warns. Eyes that stare too much, shapes that ain't quite right. This story doesn't present the cult as hidden. It makes the horror communal. The implication is devastating. The cult does not have to hide. It simply has to wait, reproducing itself until nothing else remains. These early stories form an internal network. While no central timeline is given, shared elements, books, chants, names, create the illusion of a coherent mythology. The Necronomicon appears in each, attributed to the fictional mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. The book's presence links unrelated plots, implying that all knowledge leads to the same place. Cultists chant phrases in Reliahian across stories. Fanglui maglwunaf Cthulhu Relieh wegah nuggle Feichtang becomes not a line of dialogue, but a metatextual signal. We are in the presence of the same force, even if the name changes. Even minor works reinforce this interconnection. The festival, 1925, introduces a forgotten town whose residents celebrate an ancient winter rite. The unnamed narrator, drawn by ancestry, witnesses a procession of robed figures into subterranean catacombs. The chant, the setting, the atmosphere all evoke the cult as a timeless organism. There is no clear doctrine, no origin story, only continuity. The implication is that the cult persists because it does not care who joins. It only cares that the rite survives. This mechanism of preservation explains why so many stories include ritual, not explanation. The rituals must be repeated. Their meaning is secondary. Together, these appearances establish a structural function for cults in Lovecraft's mythos. They are the connective tissue between stories. Their presence transforms isolated tales into a web. But more than that, they serve a thematic role. They remind the reader that the horror is older than the story. It existed before the characters, and it will outlive them. The cult's survival across tales is not a narrative convenience. It is a philosophical assertion that behind every human act lies something deeper, something watching, something remembered by those who were never meant to forget. As we move into case studies, this pattern sharpens. In the next 2 sections, we will explore individual stories where the cult is not just a backdrop, but a central mechanism. First, we return to the call of Cthulhu, where global fragmentation hides a terrible unity. Then we revisit The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the line between cult and community dissolves entirely. Each reveals a different face of belief, but both whisper the same idea. The cult is not growing. It is awakening. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, remains the definitive blueprint for cult representation in cosmic horror. Not because it was the first, but because it established a structural and philosophical template replicated across the mythos. Here, the cult is not localized or dramatic. It is global, fragmented, and embedded within the fabric of history. It does not seek domination. It waits. Lovecraft's genius was to frame the cult not as antagonist, but as symptom, a symptom of a deeper cosmological truth that has already rendered humanity obsolete. The story's narrative design is crucial to its effect. It unfolds as a found document, compiled by Francis Wayland Thurston, who inherits his late uncle's papers and follows a trail of inexplicable reports. The disorientation begins immediately. A New Orleans police raid, a seafaring encounter, and a sculptor's dreams, none of which make sense independently. Together, however, they form a mosaic of cultic activity centered on the figure of Cthulhu. This is the cult's first function, to connect scattered anomalies into a single terrifying continuity. It does not appear at the center of events. It is the connective tissue. The cult's reach is planetary. Inspector Legrasse's raid reveals a swamp-dwelling group engaged in ritualistic chanting. Finglui Mgulwinaf Cthulhu Relie Wugahnagel Ftagen, and centered on a grotesque idol. Meanwhile, reports from New Zealand describe an island uprising involving similar rites. And at sea, the crew of the Emma discovers the lost city of Relia itself, where a sailor named Johansson witnesses something that cannot be fully explained. These are not coincidences. They are synchronicities. The cult is not communicating between locations. It is responding to a shared signal. Cthulhu's dreams leaking from the abyss. The line between worship and infection blurs. Cult members are not portrayed as missionaries or manipulators. They do not spread belief. They respond to something innate, ancient, and inescapable. The Great Old Ones, one cultist, explains, are not made of flesh and blood. They have shape, but that shape is not made of matter. This description transcends religion. The cult is not bound by culture or language. It exists wherever the human mind cracks open enough to hear what should not be heard. The horror is not that such people exist. It is that anyone could become one of them. Cthulhu himself does not act. He does not kill. He rises briefly, then retreats. His presence is enough. What the cult worships is not his power, but his inevitability. The time would be easy to know, the cultist warns, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil. This is not prophecy. It is trajectory. The cult is not preparing for a new world. It is remembering the old one, the one that will return when history finishes its current cycle. The stars do not cause events. They reveal alignment. What makes this story profoundly disturbing is its retrospective structure. Thurston never meets a cultist. He reads about them. The cult's influence is indirect, refracted through documents, testimony, and dreams. And yet the result is total epistemic collapse. I shall never sleep calmly again, Thurston confesses, knowing that the cult still lives. This is the final function of the cult in the Call of Cthulhu, to render knowledge itself hazardous. Understanding becomes a liability, and the reader, having followed Thurston's path, is implicated in that risk. The ritual is complete, not on the page, but in the act of reading. As we transition to the shadow over Innsmouth, we'll see this model undergo transformation. Where Cthulhu fragmented the cult across space and documents, Innsmouth consolidates it into a single, decaying town. There, the horror is not the scattered signal, but the concentrated lineage. The cult no longer whispers from afar. It speaks through your blood, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. In the Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, Lovecraft abandoned the scattered cult and instead created a localized, integrated horror, a decaying New England town that is the cult. Unlike in the Call of Cthulhu, where worshippers are glimpsed in fragmented scenes and distant locations, Innsmouth represents the cult at full saturation. It is not a group within a town, it is the town. This shift reframes the cult not as an external threat, but as an inherited condition. One does not join the cult of Innsmouth. One is born into it. The narrator, an unnamed young man traveling alone, visits Innsmouth out of historical curiosity. What begins as an architectural and genealogical investigation spirals into a confrontation with a hidden lineage. The townspeople are described with eerie consistency. Queer narrow heads, bulging watery eyes, and flabby lips. They move awkwardly, avoid outsiders, and speak rarely. Early accounts from local informants describe rituals in the marshes, dark, pacts with sea gods, and a rise in wealth following the town's dealings with the mysterious Captain Obed Marsh. The horror here builds slowly, not from violence, but from pattern recognition. the cult hides in plain sight. At the center of Innsmouth's history is a pact with the Deep Ones, amphibious, ancient beings who dwell in the underwater city of Yhanthle. In exchange for gold and fish, the townspeople offer human women for interbreeding. The resulting hybrid offspring appear human at first, but slowly transform, both physically and mentally, into Deep Ones as they age. This biological horror is central. The cult is not maintained by belief, but by blood. As one resident explains, there ain't no limit to what the Deep Ones can do in the way of raising the dead and fetching things from the sea bottom. This framework collapses the boundary between religion, biology, and destiny. The townspeople do not worship the Deep Ones metaphorically. They are becoming them. The cult's rituals, held in the esoteric order of Dagon, function not as performances, but as family gatherings. The chants are not learned, they are remembered. This isn't conversion, it's reclamation. The cult is a mechanism of return. Return to the sea, to older gods, to a form of life abandoned by the surface world. There is no need to persuade outsiders. Time and blood will do the work. Lovecraft carefully inverts the reader's expectations. The narrator, initially repulsed by the town, flees after discovering the truth. Yet the final paragraphs reveal a slow, terrifying transformation. He learns that he is of Innsmouth blood, that his ancestors were part of the same pact. His dreams become vivid. The sea calls to him. "I shall dwell with marvelous beings," he writes, "who are not made of matter, and shall know the secrets that were hidden to man." This final shift reframes the entire story. The narrator does not escape the cult. He becomes its continuation. What The Shadow over Innsmouth achieves is a perfect fusion of theme and structure. The cult is not a plot device. It is the story's architecture. Every building, every surname, every distorted face reinforces the sense that the cult is not active, but inevitable. It cannot be defeated because it does not operate through ideology. It operates through biology, geography, and time. The town itself is a slow ritual, performed across generations, ending only when all boundaries between human and Deep One dissolve. As we turn next to collaborative and later expansions, we will see how this model evolved. Some writers followed Lovecraft's lead, expanding the mythos with new cults and interpretations. Others restructured the concept entirely, introducing moral systems, elemental associations, or modern anxieties. But all return to the central insight of Innsmouth. That horror is most enduring, not when it arrives suddenly, but when it has always been part of who we are. The cult is not hiding in the shadows. It's waiting in the family tree. The cults Lovecraft introduced did not remain his alone. As early as the 1930s, writers within his circle began expanding the mythos, sometimes with his blessing, sometimes posthumously. What followed was not a unified system, but a layered evolution. Cults became more detailed, more metaphysical, and at times, more structured. The horror remained, but it shifted in tone and emphasis. Rather than mere survival of unknowable truths, later writers began exploring organization, hierarchy, and theology, what a cult believes, not just what it fears. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor, imposed the most dramatic change. He restructured the mythos into a cosmic morality play, dividing entities into elder gods and great old ones, forces of good and evil, respectively. Cults became allegiances. Worship of Cthulhu or Hastur was no longer an act of existential exposure. It was rebellion against the elder gods. This framework introduced elemental associations, fire, water, air, earth, mapping ancient beings onto classical cosmology. The result was more coherent, but less ambiguous. Derleth's system gave cults purpose, even goals, but it sacrificed the indifference that made Lovecraft's horror so unsettling. Some writers resisted this shift. Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, while contributing to the mythos, preserved a tone closer to Lovecraft's. Their cults remained fragmentary, symbolic, and regionally unique. In Smith's The Return of the Sorcerer, a necromantic sect reanimates the dead, not in service to a higher being, but in pursuit of ancient rites whose meaning may already be lost. In Howard's The Black Stone, a monolithic idol is worshipped by pre-human cultists in a valley untouched by time. These stories preserve the cult as something ancient, dangerous, and uninterested in coherence. Later authors would take the mythos in darker, more psychologically refined directions. Ramsey Campbell, in particular, localized horror in the British countryside. His cults, such as those in The Inhabitant of the Lake, worship alien entities like Yigolonak, a being of obscene appetite and corrupt intimacy. Campbell's cultists are degraded, yes, but also desperate. They seek communion not because they understand, but because they need. The horror becomes more personal, a question of what humans are willing to become in the absence of meaning. In Campbell's hands, the cult is a mirror held to desperation. Thomas Ligotti, while rarely referencing the mythos directly, reintroduces the cosmic cult through a philosophical lens. In stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin, a hidden society performs grotesque winter rituals in honor of a being that may not even exist. But belief persists, because belief is all that remains. Ligotti's work reframes the cult not as a mystical organization, but as a metaphysical inevitability. If the world is meaningless, then ritual becomes the last form of structure. Cults, in this reading, are not errors of perception. They are coping mechanisms for a universe that does not care. Contemporary adaptations have taken these ideas into other media. Tabletop role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium, turn the cult into a playable threat, something to be investigated, infiltrated, or sometimes tragically joined. Video games such as Bloodborne echo cultic structures, presenting religious orders that worship the Great Ones through blood and transformation. Here, the cult is inseparable from the body. To believe is to change, and that change is irreversible. These adaptations understand that the cult's horror lies not in its goals, but in its effect on those who encounter it. Even popular television has absorbed the structure. True Detective Season 1 drew heavily from the mythos, particularly The King in Yellow, a play referenced in both Chambers and Lovecraftian fiction. Its antagonist, part of a decentralized, ritualistic network, echoes the cultic logic of the Call of Cthulhu: hidden networks, disturbing symbols, generational rot. The horror is not localized. It is embedded in institutions, landscapes, and bloodlines. The cult no longer hides in ruins. It wears masks in public, whispers in government halls, and leaves no single person responsible. What emerges from these expansions is not uniformity, but recursion. The cult reappears in new forms, sometimes theological, sometimes nihilistic, sometimes psychological, but always as a conduit to something larger. Whether organized or disorganized, self-aware or instinctive, the cult endures because it fulfills a narrative function no other entity can. It is the human face of cosmic horror. It smiles because it has accepted what we dare not admit. And in the next part of this exploration, we turn away from fiction. We examine how these cults or their reflections have seeped into real life, into rumors, sightings, and artistic adaptations. Because once an idea like this is known, it does not vanish. It waits. Rumors are the natural afterlife of cosmic horror cults. Once the fiction establishes the idea that secret worship survives beneath ordinary life, readers begin looking for echoes. Almost immediately after Lovecraft's death in 1937, claims emerged that the Necronomicon was real, supposedly catalogued in the British Museum, Miskatonic University, or private collections. None of these claims held up, but that failure only strengthened the myth. A book that cannot be found feels more dangerous than one that can. The cult persists here not as an organization, but as a rumor engine, generating belief through absence. Urban legends soon followed. Stories circulated of isolated fishing villages with odd customs, forest clearings marked by strange symbols, and remote churches abandoned after unexplained disappearances. In the late 20th century, these tales migrated online, mutating into creepypasta and forum lore. Anonymous posts described rituals interrupted, chants overheard, or wrong dreams shared by entire towns. The pattern is consistent. No proof, no resolution, only implication. The cult survives because it never asks to be verified. It thrives in uncertainty. What cannot be disproven remains psychologically active. Modern alternate reality games refined this process. Projects like the Lovecraft Investigations, or online ARGs built around hidden cults, blur fiction and participation. Players decode symbols, follow false documents, and uncover staged evidence. The experience mirrors cult initiation, gradual immersion, fragmented knowledge, and a sense of privileged access. This reveals something profound. The appeal is not fear alone, but involvement. The cult persists because it offers a role, not believer, but knower. And knowledge, even fictional, carries weight. Cinema and television translated these ideas into visual language. Films like The Wicker Man and The Ritual present communities bound by secret worship, where belief outlives individual members. The horror lies not in the ritual itself, but in its normalcy. Everyone participates. No one explains. In the endless, a cult's members are trapped in a time loop, choosing eternal repetition over death. This reframes cult devotion as a rational response to cosmic uncertainty. If time is meaningless, repetition becomes stability. Games deepen this effect by making participation unavoidable. In Bloodborne, the player joins healing churches and research cults without fully understanding their goals. Progress requires complicity. Similarly, Call of Cthulhu and Cultist Simulator force players to manage knowledge carefully. Learn too much and the game collapses. These systems echo Lovecraft's core idea. Insight is dangerous. The cult persists because it turns curiosity into risk, a dynamic uniquely suited to interactive media. Subcultures have absorbed these symbols as well. Lovecraftian imagery appears in music, fashion, and online identities. Sigils as tattoos, cult names as usernames, chants as lyrics. This is rarely literal belief. It is aesthetic alignment. Yet aesthetics shape thought. By normalizing cult imagery, culture domesticates the idea that meaning is fragile. The symbols lose their narrative context, but retain their emotional charge. They suggest depth without explanation, which is precisely how the cult functions in fiction. Why does this endure? Because the cult addresses a universal tension, the fear that the world does not care, and the simultaneous need to belong to something. Cosmic horror cults resolve this by offering acceptance without comfort. They do not promise salvation, only inclusion in a larger pattern. In an era defined by uncertainty, ecological collapse, technological acceleration, social fragmentation, that logic resonates. The cult does not lie. It tells you the universe is indifferent, then asks whether you can live with that knowledge. And that is where the question remains open. These cults persist not because people believe in ancient gods, but because the structure of belief itself has changed. Meaning is provisional. Truth is unstable. Community forms around shared uncertainty rather than shared answers. The cosmic horror cult becomes a metaphor that refuses to expire. Not because it explains the world, but because it suggests that explanation itself may be the wrong goal. The cult in cosmic horror has proved remarkably adaptable, crossing mediums without losing its core psychological effect. While its roots lie in literature, it has flourished in visual and interactive art forms, where its themes of secrecy, revelation, and transformation gain new dimensions. These adaptations rarely replicate the cults of Lovecraft verbatim. Instead, they borrow structure and symbolism, embedding them in new cultural frameworks. The result is not translation, but mutation. The cult changes form to survive. In film, the most striking examples rarely use the word cult directly. Instead, they build around familiar ritualistic elements, masks, chants, isolation, and shared delusion. The Wicker Man, 1973, is often cited, though it lacks cosmic elements, because it establishes the tone of local tradition, masking existential horror. More directly aligned is The Endless, 2017, in which two brothers revisit the UFO death cult they escaped as children. What they discover is far worse, a time loop governed by an invisible, omniscient force. The group's rituals, once dismissed as superstition, are revealed as adaptations to survive within the logic of this being. The cult is not irrational, it is coping. Games offer a unique form of initiation, interaction. In Bloodborne, 2015, cultic themes pervade the entire narrative. Healing churches and research institutions slowly reveal themselves as religious sects devoted to higher beings, the Great Ones. Their rituals are medical, academic, and devotional all at once. The horror is not that these groups exist, but that their goals make sense within the game's world. Progress in Bloodborne requires complicity. The player doesn't simply witness the cult. They follow its path, wield its tools, and eventually become its product. The final stages of the game dissolve the line between participant and worshipper. This same structure appears in tabletop role-playing. Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium, invites players to investigate cults, uncover artifacts, and decipher forbidden texts. But unlike traditional power fantasy games, the focus here is on degradation. Knowledge carries penalties, characters lose sanity, victory is ambiguous at best. These mechanics mirror Lovecraft's worldview. Insight is corrosive. The cult becomes a narrative engine not of challenge, but of collapse. The players descend into understanding, and the game ends when they understand too much. Music has also absorbed cultic aesthetics, particularly in genres drawn to existential themes. Black metal bands like Sun-O, Portal, and Ritual Necromancy craft sonic landscapes that evoke ritual rather than melody. Their lyrics, often indecipherable, mirror Lovecraftian language, suggestive, chaotic, and structurally resistant to interpretation. In dark ambient and drone music, entire albums simulate initiation from ambient dread to explosive noise. These aren't songs, they are encounters, The listener becomes the witness, and the cult, once again, operates through effect, not explanation. Visual motifs recur across media. The cultist's robe, the spiral symbol, the unreadable glyph, all have become shorthand for the thing behind the thing. In Hereditary, 2018, the cult of Paimon is revealed slowly through background figures, hidden symbols, and physical deterioration. The horror is not the demon. It is that everything, every trauma, every loss was manipulated to lead here. The cult did not act in haste. It acted in centuries. This long arc of control echoes cosmic horror's central anxiety. Not that there is no pattern, but that there is, and we are not its authors. Why does this structure adapt so well? Because it externalizes internal fears. The cult represents what we cannot face directly, the possibility that belief is hollow, that systems we trust are rigged, and that our agency is illusory. In modern culture, saturated with data but starved for meaning, the cult's persistence is a mirror. Its horror lies in endurance, not spectacle. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to remain plausible. And in film, games, and music, that plausibility is carefully maintained. As we move into the realm of subcultures and academic theory, the question deepens. Not only has the cult survived, it has become desirable, worn as aesthetic, quoted in scholarship, chanted in jest. The line between horror and fascination is thin, and the cult, in its many forms, has learned how to walk that line without ever revealing what lies on the other side. The image of the cosmic horror cult, once confined to fictional swamps, underwater cities, or ancient manuscripts, has found unexpected longevity through subcultures and academia. What began as literary invention now circulates through fashion, theory, memes, and discourse. The cult no longer needs secrecy. It thrives through irony, analysis, and aesthetic detachment. In many circles, to reference a cult from the Cthulhu Mythos is not to warn of madness. It is to signal affinity with a worldview shaped by absurdity, disillusionment, and cosmic perspective. Online subcultures have made cult imagery into shared language. Reddit forums, Discord servers, and YouTube channels adopt Lovecraftian names and sigils. Esoteric Order, the Blackstone, Starry Wisdom, not as sincere belief, but as digital myth-making. These communities treat cosmic horror as both fiction and operating metaphor. Threads about non-Euclidean sleep schedules, post-eldritch burnout, or worshipping the algorithm parody cultic language while expressing genuine disconnection from modern life. The joke is structural. Participants acknowledge that meaning is eroding, and instead of resisting, they turn the cult into a coping symbol. Not X, but the shadow of X used for survival. Fashion and art have absorbed this symbolism as well. Streetwear brands release collections emblazoned with Lovecraftian glyphs and faux Necronomicon pages. Tattoos of sigils and cult symbols, especially the yellow sign, the elder sign, or stylized representations of Dagon, appear with increasing frequency. These symbols are rarely explained. Their power lies in ambiguity. They act as shared gestures of anti-meaning, personal emblems of detachment, anxiety, or intellectual rebellion. The cult, in this form, becomes wearable, not as a group to join, but as an idea to wear. The academic world has also embraced cosmic horror as a serious site of inquiry. Scholars in literary studies, cultural criticism, and philosophy have turned to cults as vehicles for exploring postmodern collapse, semiotic breakdown, and metaphysical pessimism. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet presents the world without us as a space where horror becomes the only viable mode of thought. In this frame, the cult is not a belief system, but a structure of surrender, a formalization of the human encounter with the unthinkable. Cults appear as cultural antibodies. They acknowledge what most systems deny. Similarly, horror theorists like Noel Carroll and Mark Fisher interpret the cosmic horror cult through the lens of post-capitalist alienation. Fisher, in particular, describes late capitalism as a system that haunts us, echoing the parasitic logic of mythos cults. In his framework, the cult is not marginal. It is infrastructural. It hides in plain sight, not unlike real-world ideologies that operate without explicit consent. The horror is not that we might stumble into a cult. It's that we already live inside one, shaped by systems too vast to confront and too abstract to leave. Interestingly, this scholarly detachment mirrors the function of cults in fiction. Just as Lovecraft's cultists do not seek morality but alignment with larger forces, academic appropriations often sidestep moral panic in favor of structural insight. The cult is no longer an other to fear. It is a lens to study our condition. This raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does interpretation become participation? When does analysis become a subtle act of worship? As we move toward the psychological and philosophical implications of this persistence, we must recognize what the cult now represents. It is no longer a hidden sect. It is an idea that has outlived its own fiction. It appears in art, theory, jokes, and rebellion. It survives not because it is true, but because it gives shape to the suspicion that nothing else is. The cult, once feared, is now mimicked. And through that mimicry, it spreads. Quietly, effectively, without need for gods. Cosmic horror cults endure because they are not simply fictional. They are models, psychological, philosophical, and symbolic, for how human beings respond to a universe that offers no clarity, no comfort, and no escape. Beneath their masks, their chants, and their impossible gods, these cults represent the human confrontation with meaninglessness. The persistence of these narratives suggests that, far from rejecting such ideas, we are drawn to them. Not because they reassure us, but because they reflect what we increasingly suspect, that the world resists explanation. Psychologically, the cult resolves a paradox. We fear insignificance, but we also fear responsibility. The idea of a vast, uncaring cosmos removes the burden of individual purpose. The cult offers a third position, surrender without shame. To join is to acknowledge powerlessness without retreating into nihilism. The ritual becomes a mechanism not for change, but for orientation. One does not pray for salvation. One aligns with inevitability. In this sense, the cult is not an error. It is a coping system built around metaphysical defeat. This speaks to a deeper philosophical anxiety, the collapse of epistemological certainty. In traditional horror, monsters hide. In cosmic horror, knowledge is the monster. Cults persist because they accept this logic. Their texts are unreadable, their rituals incoherent, their goals unclear, and yet they act. This reflects a world in which information is infinite, but understanding is elusive. We scroll, search, decode, but meaning recedes. The cult becomes a metaphor for life under informational saturation. Not X, but the suggestion of X repeated endlessly, until we confuse presence with truth. More disturbingly, cults in cosmic horror challenge the assumption that sanity is preferable. Many narratives end not with the hero resisting madness, but succumbing to it, willingly. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator finds peace not in escape, but in transformation. His final words, "I shall dwell with marvelous beings," reveal that madness may not be collapse, but contact. The implication lingers. Perhaps sanity is only possible when the world lies. Perhaps truth, when it arrives, feels like psychosis. This idea resonates with modern alienation, late-stage capitalism, ecological collapse, digital unreality. These forces create a dissonance between what we experience and what we are told to believe. The cult, as a narrative form, gives shape to that dissonance. It externalizes it. People in horror stories join cults not because they are deluded, but because they want something to make sense, even if that sense is cruel. The alternative is disconnection. Madness is painful, but at least it feels coherent. What's most haunting is the way these stories never resolve the status of the cult. Is it correct, deluded, symbolic? The narratives don't say, they don't need to. The cult functions as an unanswered question. What if belief isn't about truth, but about alignment with forces beyond comprehension? This question destabilizes more than fiction. It echoes in philosophy, theology, politics. The cult becomes a stand-in for every system we participate in but cannot fully explain. Its terror lies in familiarity, and so we end not with closure, but recursion. The cult, like the horror it represents, loops. It survives by suggesting it has always been here, waiting beneath history, beneath reason, beneath the skin. It endures because we do, not as monsters, not as believers, but as those who cannot help but ask the question the cult was created to answer. What if this was never about truth at all? And if the question has been planted, then perhaps, in some small way, the ritual has already begun.